Hi everyone, this is the video presentation for module number 1 for Music Theory 3. So we're going to start off with kind of a review of some of the important things we talked about last year, which include voice leading and counterpoint and figured bass. So our objectives for this video are going to be review the principles of voice leading, review the technique of counterpoint, review writing figured bass exercises. Okay, so let's start with voice leading. Voice leading is the idea that these voices, meaning the voices in the four-part chorales that we've been composing, should move as smoothly as possible and that they should follow certain stylistic rules. So what does smoothly as possible mean? Well, that means the voices will stay on the same note from chord to chord as much as they can. And if they can't do that, they'll move by step. And if that's not possible, they will leap, but it's generally a small leap, and if we leap, we balance that leap by a step in the opposite direction. So it's really similar to the species counterpoint exercises that we worked on at the very beginning of last year. Okay, and there's a stylistic component to voice leading too, and this is what makes it sound like a certain style of music. And so these are things like avoiding forbidden parallels, so avoiding parallel fifths, parallel octaves, which are fine in other kinds of music, but not in the kind of music that we're talking about. Resolving sevenths down by step is another stylistic rule, and leading tones resolving to the tonic is another stylistic rule. Okay, so these are things that the voices naturally want to do. We're leading them through a progression, right? Okay. So the other side of that is counterpoint. And counterpoint is the idea that these voices should be as independent as possible while still working together. Okay? So basically each voice in this four-part chorale texture is its own melody, and that melody should be as interesting as possible on its own, but still able to sound good with the other voices. Now in practice, of course, that doesn't always happen, but we want to be writing with this idea in mind. Okay? So what makes the voices independent? The voices are independent because they have their own unique shape and direction. Okay, they work together because they are consonant with the other voices, and when they're not consonant, dissonances are handled effectively. So in other words, if you create a dissonance, you resolve it in the right way. Okay, and going with the independence thing, contrary and oblique motion create the most independence, and similar and parallel motion create the least. So when we're writing our other voices, adding them above the bass, we're focusing mostly on contrary motion and oblique motion. Okay? So let's go over some of the rules, the method, what I'm going to call the guidelines for writing four-part chorales. Now, we spent a lot of time on this last year. So these are just the basic things you should always kind of remember. First of all, there are four voices in this texture. That's why it's a four-part chorale. And those voices are the soprano, the alto, the tenor, excuse me, and the bass. And they all have their ranges, which you remember from last year too. Okay. And all harmonies above the bass are going to be octaves, fifths, or thirds, unless the figured bass says otherwise. So if there's a bass note with no number under it, you know that that note will be harmonized with an octave, a fifth, and a third. Okay? If there's another number, you know that that's an exception to the normal triad that we're building. It's a different kind of thing. It could be an inversion, it could be a seventh chord. Okay, but the numbers mean to break that normal default of octave, fifth, and third. Okay, so you can see on the right there that C without a figure, right? C without a number has an octave between the bass and the soprano. It has a third between the bass and the alto, and it has a fifth between the bass and the tenor. Okay, and then when you have a sixth, you have a sixth between the bass and the soprano, and then of course you have a sixth over there as well. So you're allowed to have the sixth and a third in that chord. Okay, so basically, if there's no number, it's 8, 5, and 3. If there's a sixth, the fifth of the chord is replaced with a sixth. So you're allowed to have a third, an octave, and a sixth. And then other numbers tell you what they should be too. So that 4, 2 right there, that's telling you should have a fourth above the bass. So that's F to B in that case. You should have a that's a sixth above the bass as well, between F and D. And you should have a second above the bass, and that's F to G. Okay, so that's one of the ones where the sixth is missing, but we have to just remember that we can use that interval for that chord. Okay, so voices are never more than an octave apart, except for the tenor and bass. They can be more than an octave apart. Doubling has to happen because we're mostly using triads, which means we're using chords that have 3 notes, but we have 4 voices, so something has to be doubled. And the best procedure is usually to double the bass note. That's not always the best thing to do, but usually it is. Okay, so if it's the root of the chord, if your chord's in root position, doubling it is fine. If your chord is in first inversion, doubling the bass is usually fine, unless that third is a leading tone, in which case you can't double a leading tone, right? Same thing if you have a third inversion 7th chord, like we have in that example over there. You can't double that bass note because that has to move in a certain way. So basically you want to double the bass note to reinforce the harmony, the harmonic structure, make it sound more stable, unless that bass note is a note that has to function, right? If it's a leading tone, you don't want to double it because leading tones have to move a certain way, and you'll end up with parallel octaves. And the same thing, if it's a 7th, you don't want to double that because the 7th has to resolve down, which means both of your voices will have to resolve down, and you'll have parallel octaves again. Okay? All right. So you can see in this example how the bass is doubled in general. Okay. Now, certain tones need to resolve in the correct way, like I just said. Any 7ths need to resolve down by step, and that's a 7th from the root position version of the chord, right? And any leading tones, and that has to do with the scale, any leading tones in the scale need to resolve up by step. Okay? So you can see where I have that 4-2 chord in the 3rd beat. The bottom note is the 7th of that chord, so it's resolving down by step to the E. And that B is the leading tone of the scale, and that's resolving up by step. Okay? And that is exactly what it should do. All chords should be complete, but it's okay to leave out the 5th. Okay, so the 5th is the note of the chord that does not really define the quality of the chord. So the root is important because you need to know what that chord is built around. The 3rd is important because that tells you if the chord is major or minor. And then a 7th is important because if you don't have a 7th, it's not a 7th chord. But you can leave out the 5th, and it sounds perfectly fine because the rest of the chord is implied with those other parts of the triad. So that's why it's okay to leave out the 5th sometimes. Okay? And of course, the best motion to use is contrary motion or oblique motion. Contrary motion, of course, is when the voices move opposite of each other. Oblique motion is where a voice moves in a static line and then something moves in another direction below it or above it. Okay? And the worst kind of motion is similar and parallel motion. And you can see here the motion between the soprano and the bass in beats 2 and 3 of this example are contrary motion. They move in opposite directions. And the motion between the soprano and the bass in beats 1 and 2 is oblique motion because the soprano stays on the same note and the bass note moves in another direction. Okay? So that's a good start to that one. All right. And then, of course, we want to always avoid parallel unisons, parallel fifths, and parallel octaves. Okay? So guidelines for writing 4-part chorales, kind of a summary of everything we learned the past couple years doing this. Okay? All right, so let's look at an example here. So this is sort of a how-to for a figured bass example, a refresher. So you always want to start with the soprano line and put in as much contrary motion and oblique motion as possible. The cadence is a good place to begin. Okay, so let me get the pen up here. So let's start by writing a soprano line. We're going to emphasize contrary motion and oblique motion. And we want to start at the cadence. Okay, so the cadence should probably have contrary motion. So we see that the bass line moves up by a leap. So let's see if we can have our soprano line move down by a step. So we can use an A above this chord. That's a fifth above D, which is allowed. And that can move down in the opposite direction to a G, okay, which is allowed because that's an octave. All right, great. So now we have an idea of where we're going. Let's go back to the beginning. A good place to start might be a G, and maybe we can create kind of an arc for this soprano. So let's give ourselves the first note, G. Okay, and we want to create contrary motion, so the bass line moves down. So a good thing to do would be to have our soprano line move up by step, and we can do that because we can use a third above that bass note, because 6/5 allows you to use a third. Okay, and then we could move back down to the G, but maybe for variety's sake, we could use some similar motion here and move up to a B. Okay, and then here we can put some contrary motion back in, and maybe move down to a, well, you know, actually we could go, yeah, let's move down to the A. I think that's probably the best choice. Okay, our next note, we can harmonize this E with a third or a sixth. And we could, you know, now that I'm looking at this, I might change my mind, which is perfectly fine too. So if we want to add some interest to this line, we could have our soprano leap up to a C in contrary motion, but then we have to probably change this next note. So let's go ahead and change that and see what that means for the rest of our example here. And so, okay, so if we're gonna have a C, that means that we can use that C to generate the special thing about this chord, which is the seventh, okay? Because C is a seventh above that D. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're gonna create that seventh by using what we call a suspension, okay? Now, a seventh, of course, needs to do something really special. So that seventh needs to resolve down by steps. So our last note can no longer be G. It has to be a step down from that seventh. So let's have this end up on a B, because that's a step down from the C. Let me make that a better whole note. That's a little better. Okay. So that's a pretty, it even has a leap, our soprano line. It's got good direction, kind of has a high point. I'll take that. That looks pretty good. Okay. I could play this real quick. So I'm just going to play the soprano and bass line for this. Very compelling. Okay. Now let's move on to the other voices. So the next thing you're going to want to do is write the inner voices. So next should be the alto and tenor, which should have mostly oblique motion and should complete the harmonies, so filling in the missing notes from our figured bass. Okay, and of course we want to, wow, that is really slow. Be sure to create good counterpoint and voice leading while we do this, as always. And sevenths should resolve down like we did, any leading tones should resolve up, and forbidden parallels should be avoided. All right, so let's get started on that. So it's sometimes a good idea to write them together. So let's start over here. Now, we don't really have much choice. We want this chord to be full because right now we have an octave. So we need to also have a third above the G, and we need to have a fifth above the G. Okay, and that way our chord will be complete. So the only way we can really have both of those things is if we put our alto on a D and our tenor on a B. All right, now in the next chord, we need to have a sixth and a fifth, since we already have the third that's in that chord. And so let's figure out the smoothest way that we can have the sixth. So sixth above F sharp is going to be D. So we can keep that between our alto. So that's some oblique motion there, which is good. And then we need to have a fifth of the chord, and we can have that with smooth voice leading if we move the tenor up to a C. Okay. Now, this is a case where this C is special because it's the seventh of the chord, so it needs to resolve down by step to a B. So that is written for us automatically. And here we have our third. We have a doubled third, which is interesting. And then that may have been a mistake. We'll figure out what we're going to do there. And then we will, let's see. So we need a fifth. So let's go ahead and put our alto on the D there, looking like a great alto line. So now for this chord, we have an octave, and we need to have a third and a fifth if possible. Now we can't move our alto up to an E because that will create parallel fifths with our bass line. So we could move that down to a C in our alto and have that take the third of the chord. That might work. Now here we could move that B up to a C, or we could move it down to an A. If we move it down to an A, we'll have parallel octaves with our soprano, which is not good. So we could, let's just move it up to the C and have it double that third there. That's what happens when you change the plan halfway through, but that's okay. We're adapting here. So now for this chord, we need to have a sixth, which we already have. We need to have a third, and we need to have an octave. Now our voices here are not really that great. So maybe in this case, you might want to think about editing what you did. And I think I'm going to do that. So there's no shame in taking the eraser, good lesson here, and erasing what you have and doing something better, which might make your life easier. So let's go ahead and maybe do what I was originally thinking and have us go down to the A here and have contrary motion. Oh, actually, that's what I did before. What I meant was we are going to go up to the C here and maybe have we could see if that works, keep our C there. And then that eliminates the need for the third, and that way our tenor can go down to our, well, actually, maybe our tenor, let's have that tenor do something cool. Maybe leap up to the E, okay? And our alto, let's see, it could maybe go up to, we could do some voice crossing if we wanted to. It's allowed once, I think. Okay. And yeah, this is getting interesting. So let's have our maybe alto leap up after that to the G. Okay. And then of course our tenor here, we want to eventually get this back down, but we could have it stay on the E if we wanted to. But why don't we have it maybe move down to the C? Now we want to balance these by step. So maybe what we could do is put a passing tone in here. Like that. That might work. And then, see, our alto could go to an F sharp, which we know needs to resolve to a G here. And then our tenor, we could have this go, let's see, it could go up to the D, double our bass, and we're leaving out the fifth, which is fine, and then have that stay there. I think that that's okay. All right, so some interesting things happen because I kind of changed my mind halfway through, which is fine. I think this is okay, but let's play this and see what it sounds like. Let's do that again. Not bad. Yeah, I don't see any mistakes in there. We had some leaps in our inner parts, which is fine, but they were all balanced by step. So I think that that is fine. If you find any errors in there, let me know. Again, I changed my mind halfway through, so that's what I get, I guess. So, all right, let's look at the next step. So we've written our inner voices. The next thing to do, of course, is to analyze this piece with Roman numerals. Now, we also want to identify the cadence after that too. So, remember, you always want to find the root of the chord first, and that determines the Roman numeral. So the root of this first chord is G, and in the key of G, that chord is a 1 chord. Over here, the root of this chord is a D, so this is a 5, 6, 5 chord. Over here, we're back to our 1 chord, root of G. Over here, we have an A for our root, and that's going to be a 2 chord in the key of G. Over here, we're going to have a root of C, because this is a first inversion triad, so this is a 4 chord. Over here, we have a chord with a root of D, and that's going to be a 5, 7 chord. And then finally, we end on a 1 chord. And our cadence, since we go 5 to 1, is some kind of authentic cadence. And it doesn't end on a tonic note, it ends on the 3rd, so this is an imperfect authentic cadence. Okay, great. Well, that was fun. We got some voice crossing for a little bit there. We had some non-chord tones, which we should identify that. So, of course, you want to circle that, and you want to call it a passing tone. Okay. And we had some leaps balanced by steps, which are great. So I think we did a good job on this. Okay, great. So we'll be, if you have any questions about this, let me know. We'll talk about it at our next Zoom session, as well as go over another example as well. Okay, well, thanks for watching, and have a great day.